I was 18, homeless, and stranded alone in a desert with nothing but a tiny backpack and a dark, shadowed cave. I had only two choices: either succumb to the scorching sun or fight for every heartbeat in a place that didn't care if I lived or died. Hello everyone! Before we dive in, make sure to join our YouTube family by hitting that subscribe button. Don't forget to like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, let's get into the story. The moment I turned 18, I thought I was stepping into freedom, a world where I could make my own choices and shape my own life. But instead, the world seemed to collapse under me in an instant. One afternoon, after an argument I couldn't escape with my family, I found myself standing outside the home I had known all my life. The door slammed shut behind me, echoing like a sentence I could not appeal. The heat hit me immediately, a cruel wave of desert sun that seemed to mock my vulnerability. My backpack was small and light, barely enough to carry some water, a few stale crackers, and the clothes on my back. But it was all I had. There was nowhere to go, no one to call, and the desert stretched endlessly before me like a vast, indifferent ocean of sand and rock. I remember the first step I took into the barren expanse, the sand crunching under my worn-out shoes, the wind brushing against my face with a rough whisper. My heart pounded with fear, but also with a strange surge of adrenaline, sharp and unrelenting. I walked for hours under the blazing sun, each step becoming heavier than the last. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, and my eyes burned from the relentless glare of sunlight reflecting off the sand. Every direction I looked, the horizon shimmered like a mirage, a cruel trick of light that promised water and shelter. I had no map, no plan, and no one waiting for me. I was utterly alone, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me more heavily than the sun itself. But just when despair began to creep in, something unusual caught my eye: shadow on the horizon, faint and narrow, like a dark line drawn across the endless gold. I squinted, shading my eyes with my hand, and realized it was a cave, barely visible. Nestled between jagged rocks, my heart leaped. It wasn't much, barely a crack in the rock face, but it offered shelter, shade, and perhaps a chance at survival. I stumbled toward it, my legs trembling from exhaustion, sand filling my shoes and making each step a struggle. As I approached, I noticed the cave was deeper than it seemed from afar, its mouth dark and cool, a promise of refuge from the unforgiving sun. Inside, the air was immediately cooler, carrying the scent of dust and stone. I stepped cautiously, my backpack scraping against the cave walls, and found a small alcove that could serve as a sleeping spot. The cave was far from comfortable. Rocks jutted out at every angle, and the floor was uneven. But for the first time since that dreadful afternoon, I felt a sliver of relief. I dropped my backpack, letting it fall with a dull thud, and collapsed onto the hard ground, staring at the ceiling of stone above me. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself that this was only the beginning. I had survived so far by chance, but now I needed to plan. I needed to figure out how to eat, drink, and sleep without succumbing to the desert. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but I forced myself to focus on the immediate needs: shade, water, and safety. The first night in the cave was the hardest. As darkness swallowed the desert, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind outside howled like a predator, searching for its next victim. I huddled against the rock wall, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. Every small sound, the scrape of a lizard, the distant howl of a coyote, the shifting of sand outside made my heart leap. Sleep was impossible at first. I thought about my family, about the life I had lost in a single moment, and about how tenuous my survival really was. But as the hours passed, exhaustion overcame fear, and I finally drifted into a restless sleep, my body tense and alert even in slumber. When dawn arrived, the first light of day filtered through the cave entrance, casting long golden beams across the rough stone floor. I woke with a dry mouth and a pounding head, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. Survival was no longer abstracted, it was tangible. I stepped outside the cave, feeling the sun's heat on my skin, and began exploring the area around me. I discovered small shrubs, patches of hardy desert plants, and tiny burrows that hinted at the presence of animals. I realized that survival in this environment would require learning everything about the desert, the water sources, the edible plants, the movement patterns of the creatures that thrived here. Every decision could mean life or death, and the gravity of that truth was both terrifying and empowering. I collected some twigs and dry leaves to make a small fire, careful to avoid the fragile ecosystem, and spent hours experimenting with different ways to extract moisture from plants and find shelter from the sun's unrelenting glare. Every success, no matter how minor, felt monumental. A cracked cactus that provided a sip of water, a burrow that offered shade, a pile of stones that could serve as a window. The desert was harsh, but it was also a teacher, and I was forced to learn quickly. Over the next few days, I developed routines to conserve energy. I walked only during cooler hours, drank sparingly, and slept in the deepest recesses of the cave during the day to avoid sunstroke. The desert, once terrifying and alien, began to reveal its rhythms, the way the wind shifted, the tracks of animals that hinted at nearby water, the patterns of sun and shade that could make or break a day's survival. I realized that the cave was not just a shelter. It was a base, a command center from which I could observe and adapt. I carved small marks into the walls to track time, a primitive calendar that helped me measure days without sunlight. At night, I would sit by the dim glow of a fire I managed to coax from dry twigs, staring at the stars overhead, imagining a future where I could emerge from this trial stronger, wiser, and unbroken. This was only the beginning, but in that cave, under the endless desert sky, I first felt the faint stirrings of hope, a fragile ember that could grow into survival, or perhaps even triumph. The days in the desert began to blur together, each one a test of endurance and ingenuity. I had learned to rise before the sun, just as the first light touched the dunes, and to retreat into the cave before the heat became unbearable. My body, once soft from comfort and routine, had begun to harden. My muscles ached constantly, my skin was sunburned and cracked, and my lips were perpetually dry. Yet, with each challenge I faced, I felt a strange sense of awakening, as though the desert, harsh and unforgiving, was chiseling away my fear and leaving behind a sharper, more resilient version of myself. I started to study the land around me with keen eyes, noticing subtle signs, the faint footprints of small animals, the glimmer of sunlight on distant rock formations hinting at hidden water pockets, and the patterns of wind that would determine where sand might shift dangerously. Every observation was a lesson, every mistake a costly teacher. I learned quickly that survival demanded respect for the environment, patience, and an unyielding will. Hunger became my constant companion, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Even as I forced myself to focus on the next task, I discovered cactus fruit growing in sparse clusters, their juice a bitter but life-saving source of hydration. Occasionally, I trapped small desert creatures. Cooking them carefully over a fire, I learned to coax from dry shrubs and twigs. The smoke and flickering flame of the fire became both a tool and a companion, offering warmth during freezing nights and signaling my presence to no one, yet giving me a strange sense of control over a world that had seemed so merciless. Each meal, each sip of water, each moment of warmth in the cave was a small victory, a proof that I could endure. But survival was more than food, and water it was the constant negotiation with fear, loneliness, and the endless expanse of sand that seemed to stretch into infinity. The desert was not silent. At night, the wind carried eerie sounds that I soon recognized as the life of the desert. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sending shivers down my spine, while the soft rustle of small creatures scurrying over sand reminded me that I was never truly alone. Even the stars seemed to watch over me, their light pure and cold, illuminating the darkness of my isolation. I would sit near the mouth of the cave, tracing constellations with my eyes, whispering to myself to keep the fear at bay. The nights were long and mercilessly cold, and yet they offered moments of awe, sky so full of stars that it seemed as though the universe itself had opened a door just to witness my struggle. In those moments, I felt both insignificant and powerful. Insignificant because of the vastness of the desert and the universe. Powerful because I had survived one more day. One morning, after a particularly cold night, I ventured further than I had before. The sand shifted beneath my feet, threatening to swallow me with each step, and the sun rose like a molten ball in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the dunes. I discovered a shallow depression, where water had collected after a rare desert rain. It was murky and brackish, but I drank sparingly, knowing it might be my only source for days. The desert tested me relentlessly, forcing me to think, adapt, and anticipate every obstacle. I learned to read the tracks of animals, to predict where water might pool, and to recognize which plants were safe to eat. Each discovery was a triumph, each misstep a lesson seared into my memory. Slowly, the cave and its surroundings became a complex map in my mind, a network of survival strategies that I relied on with growing confidence. Despite these small victories, loneliness gnawed at me more sharply than hunger or thirst. I had no one to speak to, no familiar voices to reassure me that I was not lost forever. The desert was both a teacher and a tormentor, its beauty intertwined with its cruelty. Yet in solitude, I discovered resilience I never knew existed. I created small rituals to maintain my sanity, marking the walls of the cave to track the passing days, humming songs I barely remembered, and speaking softly to the wind as if it were a companion. My mind, which had once been consumed with despair, began to find patterns, creating a structure out of chaos. I learned to meditate, to focus on each breath and each movement, to find calm amid the chaos of my surroundings. These practices became as essential to survival as food, water, and shelter. As the weeks stretched on, I began to notice subtle changes in my perception. The desert was no longer a barren wasteland. It was a living, breathing ecosystem with rhythms and signals. I could hear the distant footsteps of creatures long before they appeared, smell the subtle hints of moisture hidden under rocks, and feel the shifts in the wind that warned of impending storms. My senses sharpened and my instincts became reliable guides. I learned to move silently, to conserve energy, and to find comfort in the tiniest victories. Even the harsh sun became a tool rather than an enemy, learned to read its position, using shadows to navigate and conserve strength. Every day was a delicate balance, a negotiation between the elements and my own endurance. But I felt a growing sense of mastery over my circumstances. The nights remained the most challenging, alone in the cave, surrounded by darkness and the endless expanse of sand. I confronted my fears head-on. I envisioned the life I had lost and the uncertain future that awaited me. Yet with each night survived, I grew stronger, more confident, and more determined. I began to experiment with fire, using smoke to deter predators, cooking carefully, and even attempting rudimentary signals in case someone passed by. The desert became both my prison and my teacher, shaping me in ways I could never have imagined. I discovered that resilience was not just physical but mental and emotional, forged through solitude and relentless challenge. By the end of the month, I was no longer the frightened teenager who had stumbled into the cave. Was someone transformed, someone capable of facing the harshest trials with clarity and courage. The desert had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and in doing so, revealed the untapped strength within me. By the time the third week had passed, the cave had transformed from a refuge of desperation into a base of survival, a small fortress carved out in the harsh expanse of the desert. I had developed routines, learned the rhythms of the sand and sun, and honed skills that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. Every day was a negotiation with nature, a delicate balance of conserving energy, finding food and water, and avoiding the myriad dangers that the desert held. Yet as I adapted, I began to notice something more profound happening within me, a transformation not just of body and skill, but of spirit. Where fear had once dominated, a quiet confidence began to emerge, tempered by humility and sharpened by the relentless trials of survival. I was learning to trust my instincts, to read subtle signs in the environment, and to anticipate challenges before they arrived. The desert, which had seemed so indifferent and hostile at first, had become a teacher, shaping me into someone I had never thought I could be. One morning, after a night of restless sleep, I ventured further from the cave than ever before, guided by the faint tracks of desert wildlife and the shifting shadows of the dunes. Each step was a study in caution and awareness. I had learned that the slightest miscalculation could lead to exhaustion, dehydration, or worse. The landscape stretched endlessly, rolling dunes glimmering under the early sun, jagged rocks casting long, sharp shadows. I moved with care, avoiding the treacherous patches of soft sand and observing the subtle signs of life around me. In the distance, I spotted a cluster of shrubs that hinted at a potential water source hidden beneath. My heart surged with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Water was the lifeline that could extend my survival, and yet, finding it required careful planning and patience. I approached slowly, scanning the area for danger, and discovered a shallow depression where rainwater had collected. The liquid was murky and bitter, but it was enough to quench my thirst and fuel my body for the journey back to the cave. Returning to the cave, I reflected on how much I had changed. The terrified 8 who had stumbled into the desert with nothing but a small backpack was no longer the same person. My body was leaner and stronger, my senses sharpened, my mind alert and adaptable. I had learned to read the land like a living map, to anticipate the movement of animals, to identify edible plants and hidden sources of hydration, and to craft rudimentary tools and fire-making techniques. The cave, once a symbol of despair, had become a sanctuary and a laboratory for my survival experiments. I carved small notches into the rock to mark days, kept a journal of observations, and developed strategies for each potential challenge. Every day survived was a testament to resilience, and every small success reinforced my growing sense of empowerment. Despite the progress, loneliness remained a formidable challenge. The absence of human contact was a constant ache, a reminder of the life I had lost and the uncertainty of the world beyond the dunes. Yet, in solitude, I found a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. I created rituals to maintain my mental and emotional stability. I would speak softly to the cave, recounting my thoughts and experiences as if sharing them with an unseen companion. I would trace patterns in the sand, letting my fingers follow the rhythms of the wind. I would study the stars, mapping constellations and imagining stories in the flickering points of light. These practices became lifelines, helping me navigate not just the physical challenges of the desert, but the psychological trials of isolation. The cave and the desert together had become a crucible, forging resilience, patience, and inner strength. As the weeks turned into a month, my confidence and abilities continued to grow. I had learned to move silently, avoiding the attention of predators, to conserve energy during the hottest hours of the day, to extract moisture and nutrition from the sparse desert flora, and to anticipate environmental hazards like sandstorms or sudden temperature drops. Each challenge overcome reinforced my belief that survival was not a matter of luck, but of awareness, preparation, and adaptability. I began to experiment with ways to signal for help, crafting simple markers in the sand and smoke signals in the distance. Though I had no certainty that anyone would see them, the act itself, however, was empowering, a reminder that I was actively shaping my fate, rather than passively enduring it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of crimson and gold, I sat at the cave entrance, watching the shadows stretch across the dunes. The desert, once a vast, indifferent expanse, now felt intimate, almost familiar. I reflected on the journey I had undergone, the terror and disorientation of that first day, the relentless hunger and thirst, the piercing loneliness, and the gradual mastery of survival skills. Each experience had tested me in ways I could never have imagined, yet each had also revealed an inner strength I had not known existed. The cave, once a symbol of my vulnerability, was now a testament to my endurance and ingenuity. I had learned to coexist with the desert, to read its subtle signals, and to adapt to its merciless rhythms. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the wind swept through the dunes with an eerie howl. I built a small fire, carefully shielding it from the gusts, and sat beside it, reflecting on how far I had come. The stars overhead were brilliant and uncountable, casting a cold, mesmerizing light across the desert floor. I realized that survival was no longer just about meeting basic needs. It was about understanding, respect, and harmony with the environment. I had learned to anticipate challenges, to adapt to circumstances, and to find hope in the smallest victories. The desert had taught me resilience, patience, and self-reliance. I had become someone who could endure and thrive even in the harshest conditions, someone capable of facing uncertainty with courage and clarity. Homeless at 18, I had discovered the profound truth that survival is not merely about enduring hardship, but about transforming it into strength and wisdom. The desert had taken much from me, but it had also given me something far greater: the realization that I could face anything, endure anything, and emerge stronger, unbroken, and alive.